This episode is brought to you by Deus Volt Lapel Pens. Go to deusvoltlapelpens.com and use my code ChristFamilyNation26 for 10% off your next order.
What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Jesse Hughes Show. It is good to be back here. It's good to see you guys. And if you are watching this, then that means I am out of the country. I am currently on my honeymoon, and I appreciate all the prayers and support from you guys as me and my fiance, now wife, have been walking through this wedding season. And we are, I'm sure, having a great time right now as you guys are watching this. And I probably have no idea what's going on in the world as we are on a boat out in the middle of the Caribbean, but I'm sure I will get to see all of the crazy stuff you guys got up to while I was gone. Today, we have a special guest. It's his second time appearing on the podcast. He is a friend of the program, and he's going to be talking to us about a very important issue that it seems some people aren't paying, in my opinion, enough attention to, and that is the fights going on within the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, we had him on last year when Brent Leverwood resigned from the ERLC, and we got to hear about why that matters and why that's so important. And as you guys probably know from following my content, following his content, the Southern Baptist Convention being the largest Protestant denomination in the country, it has a very strong pull, and it has a very strong presence in this country. And if we allow it to go on a leftward drift like the main lines went on about 100 years ago or so, then that, of course, is going to be very bad for not only Christianity in the United States, but for the United States in general and the direction that we are going as a country. So we're going to welcome in William Wolfe to give us an update on what happened in the Southern Baptist Convention just a couple weeks ago at their annual meeting. William, how are you doing today?
Great. I'm doing great, Jesse. Good to be back with you. Always appreciate your show and your work. You're a total patriot, and I hope that we get a lot more young Christian men like you out there. So thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So we saw two big headlines coming out of the SBC just a couple weeks ago with the annual meeting. Obviously, we had Willy Rice elected as the SBC president, and we had Al Mohler's Truth and Unity Amendment pass the first of a couple of hurdles. But before we get into broader discussions about that, I just want you to give kind of an overview of what the lead up to this annual meeting this year was like, and what you did with Center for Baptist Leadership to kind of lay the groundwork for some of these big wins that we experienced during the annual meeting.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. You're absolutely right. It's very, very important what happens in the Southern Baptist Convention. In a recent article that was actually written at Mother Jones, an incredibly left-wing outlet that was still actually pretty fair and positive towards the work of the Southern Baptist Convention, I was quoted in there saying that when the SBC sneezes, the entire country says, "Excuse me." And it's true. The entire country does pay attention to what happens in the Southern Baptist Convention, and not just our country, but internationally. In the run-up to this year's Southern Baptist Convention, we saw a barrage of sort of left-leaning or moderate evangelical commentators weighing in on what they thought Southern Baptists should do about women pastors and women preaching from places like Australia and the UK. Really, it's always the moderates and the leftists weighing in because they want to make sure that the Southern Baptist Convention doesn't become too conservative again. It just goes to show you how important it is, national and international attention. And in the run-up to this year was really sort of a run-up full of hope. Hope that after many years of conservatives fighting in the trenches and taking a lot of licks and losses as we try to pull America's largest Protestant denomination back to its conservative foundations, both theologically, culturally, and politically, that we would actually win. And with the election of somebody like Willy Rice, who ran sort of outside the system, preaching on a platform of renewal and reform in the Southern Baptist Convention, addressing the issues, the very same issues that Center for Baptist Leadership has been raising for the last 2 years: doctrinal compromise, mission drift, lack of accountability and transparency, a Southern Baptist Convention that seems far more in tune with elite sensibilities as opposed to the base of our conservative Southern brethren in the Southeast. he won, and he won pretty big. He won his SBC presidential election 57% to 43%. So it wasn't particularly close. Now, he did have home state advantage in Florida, but a lot of people thought Willie would win. I will say some people were pretty surprised that he did. And those would be the elite Southern Baptists that live in a bubble thinking that people like myself and others are just a small band of rabble rousers. We aren't. We represent the broad conservative concerns of the base of Southern Baptists, as reflected in the vote to elect Willie, and then also as reflected in the vote to pass Dr. Muller's Truth and Unity Amendment, which is a continuation of the law amendment offered by Mike Law from Virginia to deal with the issue of a rising tide of egalitarianism and feminism in the Southern Baptist Convention, which affirms women pastors and preachers in contradiction to our statement of faith. We have to hold the line here. We're thankful that Dr. Mueller picked up this cause that we've been debating and voting on for the last 3+ years now. And we had another successful first vote on this constitutional amendment, and it needs a second one next year in Indianapolis. So on balance, a very successful convention for conservative-minded reformers in the Southern Baptist Convention. And it's one that we should be thankful to God for this mercy, because it's not every day that we see a conservative domination that's been drifting leftward come back to its conservative and biblical roots.
Absolutely, for sure. And we're going to get into all of that and more. But as you said, this is a huge win for Southern Baptists. This is a huge win, especially for Southern Baptist laymen like you, like myself, like all of our friends all across the country. But one thing I did want to address, because I think it's pretty interesting, when you look at somebody like Willy Rice, he is somebody that has a history of being part of the establishment to a certain extent. He's been in the elite circles. He knows this ground well. And he is actually someone who has come around on, from what I've seen, come around on many of the issues that people like you and Tom Askell and John Whitehead have been trying to bring into the fray for years now. You know, he used to be part of the more establishment side, and now he started to come around on these issues a couple years ago, and is now helping take the lead on many of these fights. So just for our audience, kind of what have you observed with Willy Rice coming around on these issues, and what kind of template do you think it gives for hopefully getting some more of these moderates that we might see across the convention, both in the elite spaces and in the layman spaces, to join our ranks and fight to make sure that these issues that are important are addressed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're absolutely right. I mean, and that's kind of part of what this convention was this year in terms of catching lightning in a bottle, or having a unicorn run, that maybe we won't have similar conditions again in the future, but we'll see. And that's that Willy Rice was very much part of the Southern Baptist Convention elite system. He's been a trustee at our major entities, including before at NAM, one of our biggest entities, the North American Mission Board, that does church planting, controls a lot of money, and really is, unfortunately, the sort of source of a lot of theological moderation in the Southern Baptist Convention life, both in sort of doctrinal practice and sort of our approach to culture. So he's been on the inside. He was going to run for president a couple years ago. He announced he was going to be nominated a couple years back. And this was sort of at the height of the so-called abuse crisis in the SBC. And to be clear, there never was an abuse crisis. The only crisis was the one that was manufactured by bad actors who tried to use a smear and hit job against the Southern Baptist Convention for their own political ends and purposes, which unfortunately they actually did pretty successfully. But Willie sort of got run over by that bus. He had been a leading voice for making sure that our churches were safe places for children and people of all ages, and that churches protected their flock from potential abusers. He was a leading voice on that, but they kind of came for him because of a circumstance in his church that was very far outside the field of sort of the typical like Me Too allegations, many decades old, dealing with somebody at his church who had an issue many years ago, who had repented of it and had been restored and was a deacon. And they essentially railroaded Willie on that when he was running. The same people he had been sort of championing threw him under the bus. that led to a period of self-reflection. And he details this in a podcast with Center for Baptist Leadership called Waking Up in a Woke World, Willy Rice's perspective shift on issues in the SBC. And so after sort of a period of sort of cooling off and reassessing, he started listening to people that maybe he had been tuning out before. And he was won over by their arguments that, there are real issues that need to be addressed. And the issues aren't what the left wing and moderate actors are saying, but it's actually what the conservative actors are saying. And so Willie really did sort of switch sides. And it does go to show, Jesse, I think this is really important if maybe your listeners are young men thinking about institutional reform efforts. At the end of the day, if you're going to win, you do have to have your own elites. We talk about we use words like the establishment pejoratively oftentimes in politics, or elites pejoratively oftentimes as well. But the truth is, every institution, every system is going to have establishment. It's going to have elites. It has to have them to function. What we want are elites in the establishments who represent fairly and advocate for the concerns of the grassroots base that aren't in those positions. In the Southern Baptist Convention life, what we've had are establishment elites who work against our interests, who work against even our stated doctrinal beliefs. Willie is now sort of an elite who is championing the cause of the grassroots base of the Southern Baptist Convention. And that's, I think, what sort of led to this victory. He was inside, then outside, but he still knows how it works. And he's very well liked and well loved in Florida, which again played a huge part to this. So really a ton of credit goes to Willie, a rare man in the Southern Baptist Convention who was able to say, I got it wrong. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to get it right this time. Will you guys support me in my effort to do that? And people did.
Yeah, absolutely. And I talk about this often with many of my friends. I talk about online. Populism is a good tool for us to use. But like you said, at the end of the day, there is going to be a quote unquote establishment. There is going to be a hierarchy of elites at the top who are making some of the bigger decisions, and laymen at the bottom who are going to be making sure to hold those elites to account if they go in a wrong direction. That happens both in our institutions like the Southern Baptist Convention, and it happens at a national level. And it is interesting to see how the Southern Baptist Convention has been kind of a microcosm of what's happening nationally in the United States. You had the church abuse crisis that you brought up that people were using to their own political benefit. And then at the broader national level, you had the Me Too movement, where people are throwing people like the Duke lacrosse players under the bus and trying to claim that there's this national crisis of abuse happening in the country, when in reality there are bad things happening and there are people that need to be held accountable. But the only crisis that's truly happening is bad actors using politics to try to further their own political interest. So it's interesting to see how that's happening both at the SBC level and at a national level, and they're almost mirroring each other, which with the direction we've been going as a country with Trump and with what's happening at the national level, it is interesting how those two things have kind of played off of each other in recent years. And so we see that with Willy Rice, and we see that also with this Truth and Unity amendment that Dr. Mulder brought. Now, I do want to, and I'm sure you will as well, give a huge shout out to Mike Law for laying the groundwork to make sure that something like this could be brought forth. But tell us a little bit about kind of what happened with the law amendment a few years ago and how that led into this Truth and Unity amendment that Dr. Mueller ended up bringing.
Yeah, that's right. Mike Law deserves to be one of the most applauded and celebrated local church pastors in the entire Southern Baptist Convention. A good friend of Mike Law, Sam Webb, recently wrote an article at the Center for Baptist Leadership talking about the perverse incentive structures of the SBC, and I think he really nailed it. Right now, we have sort of this operational system in the Southern Baptist Convention that seems to demonize and stigmatize faithful local church pastors who bring issues to the convention's attention and offer solutions, while at the same time, if institutional leaders, those in the establishment or more well-known figures, sort of bring the same solutions to the same problems, they're more celebrated and welcomed. It's a really bad system where the owners of the convention in the Southern Baptist Convention, the churches themselves, can't seem to be able to drive reform and enact positive changes without having sort of big name support for it. It's a bad system. It needs to be changed. But Mike Law did really sort of take on this yeoman's work of drawing national attention in the Southern Baptist Convention to the fact that we have hundreds, maybe even thousands of churches with women pastors. And our statement of faith says we don't believe in that. If you want to be a Baptist church with women pastors or women preachers, you certainly can be. You can go join the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, a very liberal Baptist fellowship and convention denomination that celebrates egalitarianism. We just don't do that as Southern Baptists. And Mike Law was absolutely right to say this is a problem. We need a solution. And the solution that he proposed was a constitutional amendment to clarify that any churches in the SBC that are going to have women pastors will not be deemed in friendly cooperation. That doesn't undermine the principles of local church autonomy that Baptists love and rightly celebrate. We're not trying to tell you you can't have women pastors at your church. We're saying if you do have women pastors at your church against our statement of faith, then we can choose not to fellowship with you. Go and be well fed and go in God's grace. We disagree with you. We think maybe you're in serious doctrinal error. We're not going to take your church building. We're not going to fire your pastor. We can't do any of that. So Mike Law led this effort for many years. Again, his constitutional amendment took 2 years at a 66% threshold to be enacted. He won that threshold on the first vote in 2023. And then really the entire establishment worked against him for a whole year after that first successful vote. And then we fell just a few percentage points short the next year in Indianapolis in 2024. Then in Dallas in 2025, a cadre of other sort of bigger, well-known pastors, more megachurch centrist pastors led by Juan Sanchez tried to offer a version of the law amendment again. And that fell just a few percentage points short. I think it got like 61, 62. But the thing is, the issue just hasn't gone away. We keep seeing churches with women pastors in the SBC. The governing body that's supposed to deal with this, called the Credentials Committee, keeps whiffing on sort of kicking these churches out when they should. And so Dr. Mueller this year said, okay, this is a problem. It's not getting solved. I will step up and try to help solve this. Again, it's another sort of example of an elite figure leading the charge. Now, we wish that Mike Law could have just gotten it done on his own. Again, we have that incentive structure that works against it. But Mueller took on this issue this year, championed it, led on it, in even breaking with some other major SBC leaders who weren't supportive of it or who weren't vocally supportive of it. So Mueller put his name on the line to do this, and we appreciate that. He got 74% of the vote, so it passed this year. We've got to do it again next year. And hopefully when that is ratified in Indianapolis next year in 2027, we can say thank you to Dr. Mueller, and we can say a very big thank you to faithful local church pastor Mike Law, who did the work needed for the Southern Baptist Convention to solve this liberal issue that will eat us alive if it's not addressed.
Absolutely. Now, and I think you briefly touched on this, but one criticism that I heard, obviously you have people saying, well, this is going to drive people away from the SBC. People are not going to want to come join our churches now because of this issue, which I think is a bad justification to vote against this. One critique I did hear from some people is this is already in the Baptist faith and message. This is something we already say that we all believe. We don't need a constitutional amendment to address this. However, like you pointed out, the Credentials Committee has not been doing their job. So I guess my question would be speak to why this actually did need an amendment, despite the fact it is in the Baptist faith and message, and what other work needs to be done other than making sure it passes next year to ensure that the Credentials Committee actually does its job when it comes to these churches that have women in pastoral leadership positions against the doctrine of the SBC.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, an institution is only as good as the people who defend actively the purposes and beliefs of that institution. You can put anything down on paper and say that you believe it, and that's an important first step. It's a necessary but ultimately insufficient condition for maintaining theological and institutional fidelity in a conservative Christian denomination. We can put anything down on paper, but if the churches aren't actually practicing it, then those words are meaningless. We need to demonstrate obedience to the Lord in both our words and in our actions on these things that we believe in and have believed for, many, many decades, hundreds of years as Baptists. And so, yes, it's in the statement of faith. And yes, many, many churches are just ignoring the fact that it's in our statement of faith. And so that's why we both have in the Southern Baptist Convention, and almost every other denomination works like this. You have sort of your standards, your statement of faith, things that people need to believe or subscribe to or not teach or practice contrary to. The Baptist Faith and Message does give a lot of wiggle room. Our Constitution, the way we work as a convention, gives a lot of wiggle room. We're not strict subscriptionists. We talk about being in friendly cooperation with each other, and it leaves quite a bit of wiggle room, but on this it's crystal clear there really shouldn't be any wiggle room. And so that's why we're trying to amend this article of our Constitution that explicitly says what kind of churches will or won't be in friendly cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention. And Jesse, one of the things that kind of has blown my mind over this whole debate over 4 years now is the Southern Baptist Convention did this exact same thing in recent history on issues pertaining to abuse and issues pertaining to racism in our churches. We took lines out of our statement of faith and we added them into Article 3 of our Constitution, saying we will not deem a church in friendly cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention if they're harboring unrepented abusers or if they're harboring unrepented racists. And nobody said, oh, well, we don't need to do that because it's already in our statement of faith. And why is that? Well, of course, I agree in principle. We shouldn't do those things. But let's be very honest here. Those issues are issues that fundamentally appeal to the sensibilities of moderates or those who have more left-leaning political concerns. There's no way around that. Again, I agree. I support those amendments. If we voted on them again, I would vote for them again. But those appealed to one side of the convention. This was an effort to sort of fix things on the right side of things. And now all of a sudden we're being told, oh, well, we don't need to do that. So it's funny how it works. It's funny how we can fix things when the left says there's a problem, but all of a sudden when the conservatives say there's a problem, now we don't need to do it. Well, no, we do need to do it. Fair is fair on both sides of this. And if these things matter, and they do, and if they're cultural flashpoints, and they are, then it's worth re-articulating and clarifying, particularly in our governing documents, who can and can't be affiliated and in friendly cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention on this. And so it was the exact right place to do it. Article 3 of our Constitution. So much of the opposition to it really is just a bunch of red herrings, logical fallacies, smoke screens, and ultimately people who just want to leave loopholes for some form of egalitarianism in the Southern Baptist Convention. And right now, that's just something we should not be doing. We need to be clarifying and speaking out where the world is pressing in and calling us to compromise and saying, we're not going to compromise here. And that's what this amendment does.
Absolutely, 100%. I want to get to more on the fight ahead, especially when it comes to this amendment and what we have to do next year. But before we get to that, I do want to focus on a couple other things that happened at the annual meeting this year. For one example of we had a lot of good happen at the convention, but we also had a few things that I think were not as great. In particular, there's one resolution that I'm thinking of, which was a resolution on immigration that came up. Now, I remember I read it the morning of. I saw the list of resolutions that had come out. One of my friends who was there sent it to me. I took a brief look through it, and it almost read as if the Southern Baptist Convention was trying to pass a resolution saying that you can have laws, but you basically can't have a country when it comes to immigration. Can you speak to that a little bit and kind of speak to what happened in the room and what that resolution was all about and what ended up happening with it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so Southern Baptists have been embroiled in a left-leaning immigration conundrum for a while here. It's been driven fundamentally by the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which has been steered by a George Soros-funded evangelical immigration group called the Evangelical Immigration Table. Now, within the last year, the ERLC actually officially severed ties with the Evangelical Immigration Table, a huge win for conservatives, something that I had been calling for, Center for Baptist Leadership had been calling for. Megan Basham had done great work exposing, and many others, Christ Overall, founders Tom Askell, Conservative Baptist Network, Tom Buck, you name it, John Harris, all everybody, right? So trying to make sure to give broad credit, and I'm sure there's names I missed. But we have allowed sort of left-leaning immigration sensibilities that really prioritize the sort of feelings of illegal aliens over the well-being of American citizens. And it's prioritized empathy or sympathy over just plain old justice. And justice matters as Christians. Justice is a very biblical thing that we should uphold. It's an American thing that we should uphold. And so that's the background. But I will say, this is one of the better immigration resolutions we've seen come out of the Southern Baptist Convention. It's not what I would have written, but it did do a couple of things that are positive. One, it explicitly rejected amnesty. Now, that's kind of the first time we've seen that in a while. Now, I would have pretty strong quibbles with the definition of amnesty that they used, because they sort of define amnesty as sort of the receiving of citizenship without any sort of restitution. And let's be clear, all amnesties ever have involved some form of restitution. So that there's pros and cons there. I do think it missed the mark in not sort of officially and explicitly calling for mass deportations, a key part of the President Trump immigration agenda, and something that is just. I mean, the answer to mass illegal migration must be mass deportations. That's the just and moderate and common sense answer here. And so I wish it had affirmed mass deportations. I wish it had had a better definition of amnesty. But what it didn't affirm this time was a pathway to citizenship. We've done that before. As Southern Baptists, I think we've very foolishly sort of preached and supported pathways to citizenship. That wasn't in there this year, and I think that's a good sign. So we're moving in the right direction. We're not quite all there this year. I'd say on balance, the resolutions that we consider this year as Southern Baptists were not as strong as they were last year. Last year, Andrew Walker was the chairman of the Resolutions Committee. We had some strong conservative resolutions. This year was a guy named Hunter Baker. He's got deep ties with the ERLC. And, I think it reflected a sort of a more moderate evangelical leaning, even while I think, the base of conservative Southern Baptists are more right-leaning than what we saw. That said, at the end of the day, these resolutions, they're not binding. They don't stop me as a Southern Baptist in good standing at my local SBC church calling for mass deportations, opposing amnesty. And one concern we would have is that the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission would interpret the resolution as sort of blessing their work on any number of different issues related to immigration that maybe we wouldn't support or like. But I will say, given everything that ERLC has been through lately and with the new leadership, I highly doubt that they'll be taking that resolution and then running out and supporting and defending amnesty or some bill that says it's not amnesty but actually is amnesty, like Maria Salazar's Dignidad Act. So I'm not too concerned about it. I don't love it. Better than other years, and we live to fight another day, and maybe we'll finally get a resolution in support of mass deportations next year.
Well, certainly, hopefully. We definitely don't need any support for Salazar's Dignidad Act. We definitely don't need support for a bill at the national level for the United States of America, whose title is not even in English. We don't need that as Southern Baptists. That is something for sure. But you brought up the ERLC. Last time you were on the podcast, we had a discussion about Brent Leverwood leaving and this new leadership vacuum that has come up. In the time since, a gentleman by the name of Evan Letlow, as you've pointed out, and has become the president of the ERLC. I remember listening to your podcast with John Whitehead on this when it first broke. Not much was known about this gentleman at the time. Since he has come into this position, what have we learned about him? What have the kind of beginning indicators been of his tenure as ERLC president? And did you have a chance to interact with him at all while you were at the annual meeting?
I did not have a chance to interact with him at the annual meeting, unfortunately. But I will say we still haven't learned that much about him. I think fundamentally he's going to take a more professorial and academic approach to leading the institution, focus on resource production for Southern Baptist Convention churches and pastors, more so than political advocacy in the public square in Washington, D.C. So he is not the kind of political operator that Brent Leatherwood and Russell Moore were. And that's a good thing, I think, in many ways. There's still, I'd say, a host of sort of like benchmarks or check marks we like to see to bring the ERLC back to institutional health that really haven't been acted on yet. You know, one of them would have been severing ties with the evangelical immigration table. They did do that. I do think they need to officially withdraw the support that under Brent Leatherwood they did offer for Maria Salazar's Dignidad Act. That's something they need to do. They need to take their name off this letter that they sent with a whole host of other national pro-life organizations to kill a bill in Louisiana about 4 years back that would have abolished abortion in that state. They weighed in against a bill to abolish abortion. They need to take their name off of that as well. So we haven't seen those things happen yet. It's still been pretty low key. Obviously, we can still give him some more time. You know, I don't think conservatives are going to really get everything they hope or want for in a robust, active, influential ERLC that's leading the charge on these major issues of concerns to most conservative Southern Baptists. But I do think we'll see a lot less damage done for sure under this new leadership. And obviously, new trustees will be coming in, trustees appointed by our former president, Clint Presley, who was more conservative than the three previous presidents before him, new trustee appointments under Willy Rice's first year, then hopefully a second year. And so I think little by little, we will see even more conservative shift there. I think they still have sort of a staffing problem. Their DC office is pretty vacant. We'll see who they bring in to fill that up, and that will matter. We're still very much in like a wait and see sort of pattern with them, some pros, some cons. And I think everyone would do well to sort of have pretty low expectations in terms of this new leadership. I think their main job is going to be keep the ERLC out of the spotlight and lead it to stop being such a source of division in Southern Baptist Convention life, which again, on the whole, would be a net positive.
So essentially, this is more of a transformation or a transitional period than it is anything transformational. This is more so we're going to keep ourselves out of the spotlight and kind of just work in a more low-key capacity for the time being. And that gives room for activists like yourself to be able to kind of lay a vision forward of what the future may look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, I think this is really kind of the question facing the Southern Baptist Convention across the board right now is, do we want to be careful stewards of managed decline, or do we want courageous transformational leadership at the places like the ERLC, in our seminaries, as our presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention? Other entities are sort of going through sort of generational leadership changes right now. Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which was run by Danny Aiken for many years, 20 plus years now. He's left and they have a new guy there, Scott Pace, again, a guy who I think is going to be a more academic, less political operator than Danny Aiken was. And, I think Danny Aiken is no doubt a good Christian man, a faithful husband and father, maybe very conservative on paper, but there's just no way around the fact that at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary under his tenure, we saw a lot of very troubling things. A lot of woke stuff was happening there, woke stuff on race, woke stuff on climate change, woke stuff on immigration. This is getting real niche, but there's pretty like liberal woke stuff happening in the biblical counseling world debate right now. And a lot of the bad sort of streams of thought and biblical counseling are still coming out of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. So what will Scott Pace do as the new leadership, as the new president of that seminary? I think it will be more sort of like careful stewardship as opposed to transformational, courageous, conservative leadership. So like people like Scott Pace at Southeastern, people like Evan Leno at ERLC, they're not like the Willy Rice we just elected as president of the SBC. He's a courageous, hopefully transformational leader. But I do think this is a question facing us and facing so many Christian institutions right now. Are we just, in a post-peak woke world, are we just going to try to slowly and quietly tack back to the center and play it safe? Or are we going to be unapologetically, aggressively conservative, outspoken, trying to transform our institutions, impact society, and fight for our country at such a pivotal moment? I think sort of that remains to be seen across the board in the Southern Baptist Convention.
Once again, the SBC is proving to be a microcosm of things happening at the national level, because you look at the Republican Party right now as we're about to grapple with what happens post-Trump. You look at the national environment right now, and the question is the same as it is with the SBC. Is it going to be a slow, managed decline, kind of tack back toward the center, or are we going to go for bold, courageous leadership that's going to chart a new way forward? It's always interesting to see those parallels. Now, speaking of bold and transformational leadership and a man of vision, one thing that you got into the news for is introducing a friendly amendment to one of these resolutions that would have honored the late, great Charlie Kirk, someone who you and I both appreciated and both reacted to very strongly when he was so brutally and publicly murdered. Kind of give us a view into how you decided to offer that amendment, what that thought process was, and how that kind of whole debate ended up playing out. Unfortunately, the amendment did not pass, but just kind of give us an overview of what happened there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the same sort of conversation we're having here. The Southern Baptist Convention had a resolution denouncing political violence and talking about our speech in the public arena, public square, the political discourse. And it didn't mention Charlie Kirk by name. It lamented general acts of political of violence and even mentioned assassinations and assassination attempts. So it's probably a nod to Charlie Kirk, a nod to President Trump. Even one of our own Southern Baptist Convention pastors, Jonathan Parnell at City's Church in Minneapolis, his church was stormed by violent, leftist BLM and anti-ICE protesters. Now, we did bring him to the SBC, and he opened a session in prayer and was publicly honored, and that's good because he's one of our own. But I thought it was too safe. It's just, clearly to not name Charlie Kirk, in my opinion, it was a way to not try to ruffle the feathers of sort of a loud 15% of, Southern Baptist moderates or leftists to have an uninformed and yet negative opinion of Charlie Kirk. They probably believe the talking points from the left about him, which aren't true, and so I thought it was, I really felt just sort of strongly in my conscience that we should try to name Charlie Kirk here. And so that's what I tried to do. I tried to amend the resolution to honor Charlie Kirk, lament his tragic assassination, praise him for his public witness, not just politically, but particularly as a public Christian figure. I was there in person at his memorial service. The gospel was preached over and over again. We've heard reports that as many as like 100 million people around the world tuned in for that, making it probably one of the largest gospel proclamation events in modern history. And I just thought it was odd that as Southern Baptists, again, America's largest Protestant evangelical denomination, that we would overlook that. And so I tried to remedy what I thought was sort of a misstep. And, like you said, it didn't pass. I offered it, and the resolutions committee didn't want to accept it because it made a specific name, put a specific name in there. I pointed out how we actually have done this before in a 2018 resolution. We specifically named the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and said, if we can name Martin Luther King Jr., why can't we name Charlie Kirk? A good friend of mine, Ryan Heffelbein, was the one who was managing that resolution for the resolutions committee. And, Ryan gave a very moving testimony about his love for and friendship with Charlie Kirk. and said ultimately they'd leave it to the will of the messengers. I will say too, it was Wednesday afternoon. The room was pretty empty. A lot of people were gone. And it didn't pass. But I will say this, because I've gotten some pretty, I'd say, nasty criticism for offering this. People accusing me of pulling a publicity stunt or even criticizing my apparel. You know me, Jesse. I try to dress well in almost every public engagement that I do or attend. But I had my Charlie Kirk Freedom shirt. And I wore that t-shirt to honor Charlie Kirk. And I actually had people sort of attacking me for wearing a t-shirt at the mic at the Southern Baptist Convention, when it's like, well, it's clearly the Charlie Kirk t-shirt because I'm trying to honor Charlie Kirk. But all the sort of nasty naysaying aside, there was a ton of support. And at the end of the day, I'm so glad I did it. And here's why, Jesse. If I hadn't gone to that microphone and offered that amendment to that resolution, we would have, the entire Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting, less than a year after the highest profile public assassination of a political figure in America, Charlie Kirk, we would not have even mentioned his name. So just by merely offering the amendment, Charlie Kirk was mentioned. He was honored. I hope and trust he was honored in the words that I had to say. I believe that Ryan Heffelbein honored him well from the platform too, in his response and stewardship of that conversation. So I'm so glad I did it. It was an absolute win, even though it wasn't adopted, because we got to talk about Charlie, reflect on his legacy, and honor him in a conversation. And if I hadn't offered the amendment, we wouldn't have done that.
Quick shout out, by the way, to Ryan Helfenbein. Ryan is a patriot. I love that man so much. He has been a very, very informative and influential figure in my life. So big shout out to Ryan. We love him on this program. But no, absolutely. Charlie Kirk deserved to be honored and mentioned, especially not only because he was the highest profile political assassination of this century, but in my estimation, in my opinion, he was probably the most high profile Christian martyr of this century as well, especially being here in the United States of America, somewhere where I don't think a Christian has been martyred in probably centuries before this. Obviously, we've sent missionaries abroad. You think of people like Jim Elliot, but on our own soil. And so to have the largest Protestant denomination in the country full of evangelicals, the very same evangelicals that Charlie spoke to and tried to bring along into this broader political coalition, to have gone the entire time without his name even being mentioned would have been a great disgrace. And we are very thankful that you took the initiative and took the courage to go out there and do that. And I do want to say to the haters and to the critics, William is probably one of the best dressed men I know. He gives me a run for my money. You guys know how I dress. I get told all the time at school, I'm the only person some days wearing a suit. You guys know how I like to do things. And William gives me a run for my money. So to criticize him for wearing a t-shirt, I think is just utterly ridiculous. But thank you for doing that. That was certainly something that needed to be done, given the fact that his name had not been mentioned previously. And like you said, if we can mention Martin Luther King Jr., who there's been some waves with in the last few years, we'll just leave it at that. If we can mention him, we can certainly mention Charlie Kirk. One thing you brought up is that during this particular part of the session, there was not a lot of people in the room. It was more of an empty room. And I did see some criticisms online, particularly coming from Pratista and people within that sphere, of the fact that with some of these votes, especially the vote for president and the vote for the Truth and Unity Amendment, it seemed like there was a lot of people who were present at the annual meeting but were not in the room actually voting. Now, maybe because of the way that these votes ended up going, that ultimately was a good thing. But at the same time, if you're there to do business, then you should be there doing business. Can you speak to that at all? Like, what were these people doing that they weren't in the room actually voting and taking on the business of the convention like they should have been?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a real issue in the Southern Baptist Convention. We have a culture when it comes to our annual meetings of attendees that don't want to do the hard and necessary work of business together. And it's a both and, like, we get it's both the body of the thousands of messengers that are in the room and the leadership from the stage, from the platform, that for many years now has sort of treated business and debate and discourse as sort of a nuisance, something to be rushed through and hustled over and even stifled and stopped at times. What are they doing? And well, they're in the exhibitor convention hall, which is, maybe that needs to be downsized. Maybe we don't need to have such a massive exhibitor hall that draws, thousands of people away during our business time, or maybe we should close it when we're in business so people can get in there and vote on the things that their churches sent them to vote on. Maybe they were at the parks, maybe, who knows what they were doing. But I, in some ways, I can't blame them when you think of sort of like the masses and crowds and how they work. Well, they respond to incentive structures and signals. And so if our leadership is sending signals, or there's incentive structures that say, well, it's not that big of a deal if you're here, it's not that big of a deal if you vote, and business isn't that important, you can't blame them for responding to that. So we need our messengers to sort of steel their spines and resolve into themselves that they're going to be in the room, they're going to want to debate, we're going to do more than just celebrate here, right? We can celebrate the work of the Southern Baptist Convention 363 days out of the year. But for 2 of those days, when we gather together, it's time to do the business of the Southern Baptist Convention. And that involves being present for major votes, not just on a president or major amendments, but on these resolutions and on other things as well. And so, I'm not sure what it will take to sort of change this culture. Again, I think new leadership, I think Willy Rice hopefully will be friendly to doing more serious business next year, maybe can even just change the program on that. We'll see. Michael Clary, a guy who's written at CBL quite a bit, a pastor, has some great books. He's got a great book coming out. He wrote about how he thinks our annual meeting is often too much sort of like just sort of one mass infomercial for the gospel work of the Southern Baptist Convention. And look, again, we do gospel work. That's incredible. We should do it. But this is the one time out of the year that we all get together to do business. It's not a church service. That's the thing. It's not a church service. Well, I really think we could cut down on the time we spend in worship. Shane and Shane, they were leading worship for us. And, one afternoon session, they ran over like 20 minutes. And it's like, okay, great. Maybe the Holy Spirit you thought was leading you, but the schedule says we have business to do, and so you should respect that. So less worship, less celebration, and more business. That maybe sounds odd to Christians, but Christians also need to use their common sense, right? And we can't just sort of use sort of pious, good feelings, sort of Christianese to get out of doing the gathered business of Southern Baptist. So we'll see what next year's hold. I'm glad this is a topic of conversation and is getting attention because it does need to be changed in some way, shape, or form here going forward.
Listen, God gave us the Holy Spirit. God commands us to worship, but God also gave us prudence and wisdom. And at least from my perspective, I don't think it's very prudential or very wise to go over 20 minutes and not get the business that you're there to get done. But that's just me. Maybe it's my young naivety. I don't know. But I do want to address a couple more things here just before we get going. One thing that has been a big issue over the past few years that at least from what I've seen, and maybe I missed something, but at least from what I have seen, kind of appeared to have taken a back seat this year is this whole issue of financial transparency. It didn't seem as if it was addressed, at least from my perspective and what I saw online, in as much of a way as it has in the past. Can you speak to that a little bit? Was there any movement on this financial transparency issue this year? And if not, are there any plans to try to address and tackle this going forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's one of the biggest issues hanging out there that Southern Baptists need to solve. It's not just financial transparency. It's sort of a broader accountability and transparency that needs to be delivered to the Southern Baptist Convention churches from our entities. That includes financial transparency, but other things as well. Willy Rice, as he was running, he was talking about proposing a task force on like accountability and transparency. And so I think some of the main champions of this issue, like Pastor Rhett Burns from South Carolina, was sort of hanging back and waiting to see what Willy Rice was going to do or who would offer something like that. At the end of the day, that sort of motion wasn't offered, but Willie Rice did win. So I think now we're hoping, and then this is a right hope, that under Willie's leadership as SBC president, he just goes ahead and appoints some kind of task force to study the issue of accountability and transparency and make recommendations to the Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting next year. I think he has the authority to do that even without a vote. I mean, a vote might have helped sort of solidify it in some ways, but he can still do it. He should still do it. There were a host of motions offered during one of the business sessions pertaining to accountability and transparency. There's requests that entities produce reports of how many of their employees are coming to the convention. They're asking for the convention to tell us, out of all the messengers gathered here at any given convention voting, how many work for the entities or on their payroll. There were motions about conflicts of interest, asking the entities to divulge more explicitly and publicly conflicts of interest that may exist amongst trustees and trustees' spouses as well. Unfortunately, a whole bunch of transparency and accountability related motions that were made, they sort of all got tabled indefinitely by this one move from one messenger during a session, who essentially made the point that the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention has too much work to do already. They can't keep, dealing with all this, and let's just table all these indefinitely. And unfortunately, that passed. It kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier. It's like people don't want to do business, people don't want to do work. And so, we didn't move the ball so much on that issue this year, but by no means does that mean it's going away. I think as we look to this next year, particularly as sort of particularly at Center for Baptist Leadership, as we're sort of seeing a new president, we're seeing hopefully the finish line of the law amendment / the Truth and Unity Amendment, that we really kind of pick our target on this and do a lot of issue education. We need to educate the messengers on this. And I think there's some messaging tweaks that need to be changed. I've mentioned this to some other people. We were talking about the financial transparency using this phrase 990 level financial transparency. The Form 990 is what nonprofits file with the federal government. A lot of religious institutions and churches are exempt from filing those, and rightly so. That's fine. So people, when they heard 990 level financial transparency, they keep thinking, well, does this mean we're going to have to file something with the government, with the IRS, that we're not required to file? No, but that language confused people. So I think we need to sort of change the messaging on it, drop the 990, and just talk about sort of like enhanced financial transparency, or enhanced accountability, and really do the work to educate the people who will be there in Indianapolis and in the years to come, that these are important changes we need to make, because, at the end of the day too, if we can fix our doctrinal issues, batten down those hatches, solve the women pastors, get new leadership. But if there is widespread distrust in the Southern Baptist Convention, and there is, because of a lack of accountability and transparency, then churches won't be giving, and our missions will hurt, and our giving numbers will continue to decline as they have been. And again, it's just sort of slow, managed decline. Look, there might be some pain. It might be like yanking off a Band-Aid to open up the books, and show the churches how the money is being stewarded and spent and what people are making and conflicts of interest and, some balance sheets, expenses and revenue, things like that. We'll get over it. We're all big boys and big girls. We can handle this together. It will help our trustee system function better. And so it's not going away. I think Willie will be a champion for increased transparency and accountability, and we'll see what he proposes here in the months to come.
As we look ahead to next year and as we start moving in that direction, I want you to imagine for a moment, and given the fact you do have a relationship with Willy Rice, this could be more possible than most hypotheticals, but imagine for a moment Dr. Rice comes to you and says, William, I want you to advise me. What are the top 3 things that I need to handle in this year in a lead up to the annual meeting coming up in Indianapolis next year? What would you tell him?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the number one thing is that Willy Rice goes all in on helping the Mueller Truth and Unity Amendment get ratified in Indianapolis. And he's already said he's going to. He said it in the press conference, his first official press conference at the end of the annual meeting. He said, I'm going to do everything I can, which is a huge change because the last time something like this was on its second vote, the president at the time, Bart Barber, did everything he could to defeat it. So having the bully pulpit behind the Truth and Unity Amendment, I think will go a long way. So that's number one. We have to ratify that in Indianapolis. And I hope and trust and am very confident that Willy Rice will do everything he can to see that happen. The second thing I would say would be show us what the path forward is on increased accountability and transparency from the entities to the churches. Give us the task force. Give us give us something, put together a body to study this issue that will make real, tangible, achievable recommendations back to Southern Baptists so we can open the books and restore trust through transparency to our denomination, to our convention, so that we can thrive again. And then the third thing that I would say I would like to see him do is really just be a champion for the churches. That we say that churches that the heart of the convention is in the churches and not in Nashville, Tennessee, where the Southern Baptist Convention headquarters are. The headquarters of the SBC is the local church. We say that, we don't really practice it. As I said earlier, when the local churches take ownership, faithful unknown pastors like Mike Law, they're treated like bad guys, right? So if Willie can do something to sort of change that culture and really be the mouthpiece for the churches, I think that will go a long way. And I will say that is going to, I think, inevitably entail some conflict with the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention, which I think really has been led poorly, is out of step and out of touch with conservatives, is very insular and self-protective, and is such thin skin of criticism. Our current executive committee president, Jeff Orr, is so thin-skinned towards criticism. And so, like, for Willie to be a champion of the churches, even if that means going to into conflict with the executive committee, which is sort of the Southern Baptist Convention's bureaucracy and deep state, that will be absolutely critical. So passing the Truth and Unity Amendment, doing something to move the ball forward on transparency and accountability, and really being a champion for the local churches, even if that means coming into conflict with our bureaucracy and the SBC. Those would be the top three issues I'd be looking for.
I remember last year when I had you on, we talked about Jeff York a little bit. And I remember last year, one of the things he said that was if the law amendment got passed, it would open up the SBC to legal trouble, to legal risk. And I remember talking to you and saying, well, I can just call up ADF. There's a thing called the First Amendment. You guys are good with that. But that is the kind of entrenched interest and trouble that Willy Rice is going to have to deal with as president. And I think that opens things up into this next question I'm going to ask. As we're looking at Willy Rice, he is a champion on these issues. He is someone who is going in there with the mindset of, I'm going to try to make change the best I can. However, two things. He's still a human being. He's going to make mistakes. We all do. And he's going to have to deal with these deep entrenched interests. When we look at the national level, when we look at the Trump administration, you have a lot of consternation right now because Donald Trump came in 2024 making a ton of promises, many of which he has tried his best to keep. And I will give him credit. He has tried his best to keep. And he has made a lot of good progress on those promises. But it looks like there's a lot of young men, particularly, who, because it seems like they're not getting everything they want, a lot of them are threatening to check out or have checked out and are trying and are going saying Trump's betrayed us and this and that and the other. How do we ensure that young men in the Southern Baptist Convention or who are Southern Baptist adjacent, if they don't get everything that they want from a Willy Rice presidency, don't fall into that same trap?
Yeah, another great question. I will say that people are noticing that of all really major conservative evangelical denominations in the United States of America, only one is moving to the right, and that's the Southern Baptist Convention, which is true. And it's really remarkable, Jesse. It's amazing to see that narrative. And some people might have ill purposes in sort of advancing that narrative, but I think it's true. And it's incredible because it's so hard to move these institutions when they start drifting and falling into sort of mainstream, moderate, or even liberal positions politically, theologically. And so if I'm a young American conservative evangelical guy with Baptistic um, leanings or Baptistic theology, I mean, the Southern Baptist Convention really is the home for you. It's the quintessential American denomination in many ways. It's anchored and rooted in the American Southeast, which is the most growing and prosperous region of our country right now, and so like this is as American as apple pie to be a part of a Bible believing Southern Baptist Convention church. And because of local church autonomy, you can have a lot of freedom to live and breathe and hold conservative and even right-wing beliefs within your church if you have a good and faithful pastor who's not going to struggle you for those beliefs. So that's obviously important. But the denomination itself, I mean, we're seeing some of these other denominations are sort of taking official denominational authoritative actions against young men in a way that the SBC isn't and can't. In terms of, what do we do when Willy Rice does something we don't like or we don't get everything we hope for? Well, we just keep fighting. We fight another day. I mean, you're never going to get everything you want right out of the gate. It's an imperfect world full of sin and mistakes and fallen human beings. And if you doubt that, you can look in the mirror because it starts at home, it starts with each one of us. And so I think we want to be productive coalition partners, advocating for positive changes and reform, and really taking on the responsibility of stewardship in the SBC. I can't tell you how many conversations I had at the SBC annual meeting where I found myself talking to I don't know, late 20s, 30s, late 30s, maybe early 40s layman, a man who's not a pastor, is a layman in his local church who realizes that fighting for the fidelity of the Southern Baptist Convention is a cause bigger than himself, and wanted to be a part of it and funded his own way to come to be there to vote for these things that matter. So I hope to see more and more, the more conservative laymen and just in general sort of conservative men that we get involved in the Southern Baptist Convention, the better it will be. And I hope that this year is a little bit of a down payment of what it could look like when, unapologetic, courageous, Bible-believing conservatives show up and win and ultimately start to matriculate into the ruling class of the Southern Baptist Convention, for lack of a better word, right? Leadership roles, if maybe that's the more sort of palatable and appropriate word, right? We need these young conservative men to aspire to leadership in the denomination. And I think Willy is going to show us a path for them to do that.
Absolutely. I've got one last question for you, and then we're going to head out here. But for this last question, I want to kind of move. We've talked a lot about interdenominational debates and things that are going on within the denomination. I want to kind of move to a broader national perspective. At the annual meeting this year, Governor Ron DeSantis gave a address to the convention. I believe Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, also gave was present at some sort of event at the annual meeting. You can correct me if I was wrong on that, but I believe that happened. You've got Hawley, who's a Presbyterian, and DeSantis, who's a Catholic, both coming to the Southern Baptist Convention at the same time that they are both being mentioned as potential contenders for the 2028 presidential election. You said at the beginning of this, when the Southern Baptist Convention sneezes, America says, bless you. Personally, I want J.D. Vance. I like J.D. Vance. And I also personally agree with Steve Deace that ultimately the 2028 nominee is going to be picked by President Trump. That being said, what do you think that the role the Southern Baptist Convention is going to play in that process will ultimately look like? And is it going to be as big as it has in past years, given the fact that Trump is going to have more of a say in it, or is it going to be maybe a little bit more dialed back than we've seen?
Yeah, that's also a fantastic question, Jesse. So, Senator Hawley recently spoke in chapel at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. So he was on campus there, but it was in the month running up to the SBC annual meeting, which is where Governor Ron DeSantis did attend and speak at a side event. But the point stands is that both Senator Hawley and Governor DeSantis are acting upon a reality that many people do know, which is that Southern Baptists matter in American conservative electoral politics. And I think it's important for Vice President Vance to actively and intentionally court Southern Baptists to speak to them. As a former evangelical and now a Catholic convert, I think that Southern Baptists want to hear from him, and then look, Vance does a good job talking about issues of faith in America. He's unapologetically defended the reality that America is a Christian nation. He's talked about how we are founded as a Protestant nation too. So those are really good, strong points for him to be leading with. He's on sort of a tour right now talking about the release of his new book. And so you're absolutely right too, that I think President Trump will sort of pick his own successor. And most naturally, that's going to be Vice President Vance. It's going to be Vice President Vance's nomination to pick or to leave if he wants. That's just how it's going to work, right? Rubio's not going to primary Vance. I'm sorry. Anybody who thinks that's going to happen, if Vance is going to run, Donald Trump is going to support him, and Rubio is not going to primary him. That's never going to happen.
Rubio literally said he will support Vance if Vance runs. So I don't know where people are coming up with this crazy idea that Rubio's going to primary him.
Well, we've seen just sort of the insanity already just sort of blowing up in terms of people trying to sandbag Vance ahead of 2028. Fundamentally, people who want a return to moderation, who want a return to the establishment GOP, because Vance will be the torchbearer for America First and the MAGA movement. And I think that would be a fantastic thing to see. That doesn't mean he won't be challenged by other people, right? I don't think Rubio would challenge him, but maybe Hawley would run. Maybe DeSantis would run. Maybe other people will run. And I think making sure that you are addressing the concerns of Southern Baptists and courting their vote and support is critically important. And I hope and trust that we'll see Vance do that more explicitly here in the weeks and months to come. He's got time to do it for sure. But you can't sleep on Southern Baptists. Our votes count. Our votes matter. We need to recognize that about ourselves. That's not a distraction from our gospel mission. In fact, one of the main ways that we fulfill our gospel mission in America and around the world is by fighting to ensure that America remains a country in which the freedom of religion and the Christian faith can flourish. I mean, China doesn't send missionaries like America does, right? Something like the International Missions Board of the Southern Baptist Convention is an organization that is pretty much only possible in a country like the United States of America. And if we lose America to the left, to the communists, to the progressives, it's going to have very serious negative ramifications for our evangelistic and missions work here at home and globally. So we want people leading this country who will be champions of our First Amendment freedom of religion and recognize in particular and the priority of and the importance of the Christian religion to America's founding and its future. I think Vance is doing that. I hope to see him do more of that going forward as well.
A wise man who shares your last name once said something about evangelicals being lone bulwarks against moral insanity, and that is certainly true of the Southern Baptist Convention. William, thank you so much for being here today. I'm sure we could have talked about for hours about all sorts of other issues that are going on within the convention. Just before we leave, give us your final last words, whatever's on your mind, and where people can find you and your work.
Yeah, well, thanks again, Jesse, for having me. Thank you for those wonderful questions and this conversation. Again, total patriot, I value 100%. Everybody make sure to follow and subscribe to the Jesse Hughes Show. I'd say we should be thankful. I think God has been merciful to the Southern Baptists after a decade plus of very discouraging and disappointing events and drift in the Southern Baptist Convention. We're seeing signs of life and signs of a fight for fidelity, a fight for the Bible, a fight for Orthodox faith and Orthodox practice in our convention. And that matters greatly for the future of this country. I've said this over and over again, and I'll say it again here now. The left understands how important the Southern Baptist Convention is, and that's why they're constantly trying to subvert and fracture and take us off of the playing field and put us on the sidelines. And we can both share the gospel, plant churches, and send missionaries and train pastors, and recognize our importance as a critical institution, Christian institution in American life, and to try to revitalize ourselves for the good of our country in the 21st century. That's the mission of Center for Baptist Leadership. And in terms of finding us and supporting us in that mission, you can follow us online at Baptist Leaders. You can subscribe to us on YouTube, Center for Baptist Leadership as well. Follow me on X at William Wolfe. And if you happen to be listening to this and you would like to support our ministry, you can make a generous tax-deductible donation at Center for Baptist Leadership /support. And we would love to have you partner with us.
Thank you so much to William yet again. William is also a total patriot, and I avow him 100%. So thank you to William for being here today. And thank you guys for watching. When I get back from my honeymoon, I expect you all to fill me in on what happened while I was away, because I'm sure I'm about to miss a lot of crazy stuff given what's going on in the world right now. But thank you guys for watching. Go support William. Go support his work. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, hit like, share this with your friends, comment. If you're watching on X, follow, repost this, do all of the things. God loves you, and so do I. Thank you guys, and have a great rest of your week.